Hello there and welcome to my new painting on how to paint a loose goose in acrylics in 2 stages. The first stage is the underpainting stage. Now I've already drawn out the goose on a canvas panel and I've just given it a light spray of water, and now I'm going to give the canvas a whole tone of raw umber. This is a transparent tone, so the drawing will just about show through. Now, giving it a tone of raw umber is giving me a warm background to paint on. It's much better than using stark white, which is very, very cold. The white of a canvas is a very cold colour, so this is what the old masters used to do. Always ground the canvas first before you paint on it. So this is a transparent raw umber. It's just loosely knocked in. I'm not trying to get a nice smooth background. It doesn't have to be smooth, just nice, loose, rough and ready. Then while it's wet, I'm not going to let it dry, the background in this case. I'm going to leave it wet. It will dry fairly quickly anyway, and I'll start adding some of the lighter areas, the highlights, or the whitest parts of the painting. Now, using a relatively large brush, and I'm holding the paintbrush towards the back end, not near the ferrule of the brush, not near the bristles. This way you won't be able to paint detail. You are forced to paint loose, which is the whole aspect of this video, is learning how to paint loose and free your arm. Normally when you paint detail, you're using your wrist in tiny little movements. This should be your arm. Use your arm and you'll find that the brush strokes become much bolder. And that's what we're trying to achieve here, is the boldness of the brush stroke. That is what is so alluring about painting in this style. We're more concerned with the brush strokes than we are with detail. Now also in this stage I'm going to try and create contrasts, while we're just knocking in the basic shapes. So I want the areas of certain areas of the painting to stand out. So obviously around the head here I'm using a little bit of a darker tone of the raw umber. It's just raw umber and titanium white at this stage. But this will make the goose really stand out, the head of the goose, against the background. Now, because it's acrylics, they will dry relatively quickly, so we can keep going over these areas until we're satisfied with the design, the graphic design elements of the painting, and the tonality of it. That's the beauty of acrylics. You can easily just go over an area if you're not happy with it. You can see how loose and messy I am at the moment doing this. I'm not bothered about detail. It's about trying to create a feeling for the painting and a feeling for the subject. So slowly build it up, bit by bit. I need to get a mid-tone now into these, into the goose itself. So again, we're just using the raw umber and white. What could be easier? Just 2 colours. Don't be afraid of going over those drawing lines that you have just produced. At the end of the day, it's a painting, it's not a photograph. That is one of the biggest sort of hurdles to get around when painting loose, is you're painting a painting, you're creating a painting, not a facsimile of a photograph. So again, I'm just using a little silicone scraper here just to move a bit of the paint around. You could use anything to do this, just create marks and scratches and scrapes, and at this stage it doesn't matter what you do because we'll be painting over it in the second stage. But all these little marks will create an interest in that background and in the painting in its entirety. So while the paint's wet in this particular area at the bottom, I'm just going to sign it by scratching into it with a little Bradall type tool. Because the paints in this area I'll be going over are transparent, so the signature will still show through. I like to do this at this stage, but that's my own personal way of doing things. You can sign it with a paintbrush at the end if you prefer. Now with a smaller brush, I'm just going to put some of those details in that I think are most relevant. Remember, when you're doing a painting like this, that the detail areas are going to be where the viewer's eye are going to focus and rest. So wherever you want the viewer to look in the painting, that's where your detail must be. You don't need to do too much detail either. So here we are, scratching and scraping again, creating those interesting areas. This is just a technique I've developed, but you can develop your own technique. Remember, if you're painting along with this, see what happens. Just use anything to create marks at this stage. You could use a sponge, a scraper, a knife, anything that comes to hand. We'll let that dry, and then this is now stage 2. We're adding the colour. So after it has dried, a little light spray of water, and then I'm giving it a coat now of retarder, 60% retarder, 40% flow improver. The flow improver allows the retarder just to move around a little easier and your brush strokes to move around a little easier. On screen now are the colours I shall be using. So I'm going in again with a white, but this has a little bit of yellow ochre added to it just to warm it up slightly. So I'm just reaffirming those light areas. You don't want pure white at this stage now, we're doing the colour. Pure white is again too harsh and cold. And we're trying to achieve a nice warm dappled sunlight area where the goose is, and it's hitting the goose in certain areas and picking parts of it out. And the areas in shadow or mid shadow are going to be a little bit cooler. So a little bit of blue into the area, or Payne's grey and white. And if you want it a bit cooler, just add more blue. If you want it a bit warmer, you add a red or a burnt sienna to that grey. Greys are most important in paintings. Greys can be made out of all sorts of colours. So I've just added a little bit more warmth to it and a bit lighter air, lighter sort of tone. It's gone a little bit greeny here and there, which is a nice tone to have on a white subject. Again, I'm being loose with this. When using this retarder, it allows the paint to move easier on the canvas and also keeps it wet for quite some time. You will see that blending is so much easier when using this medium, something which is normally very difficult to do with acrylic paints as they dry so quickly. So this medium will allow the paints to dry much more slowly. And in a way they will act very similar to oil paints. Not quite as thick, although you can add thickening mediums to the paint to create those impasto areas, but they will tend to speed up the drying process. So we're just using standard thickness paint at the moment. Again, I'm still moving the paint around with the back end of the brush. The back end of the brush can be just as important as the bristles. Use your fingers if you need to move paint around as well. Fingers are a very, very important tool, and very subtle effects can be achieved when using fingers. So I'm just creating a few little warm areas now with a bit of cadmium orange. All the time you're trying to achieve a harmonious appearance to the overall painting. So if you have colour in one area, try and put a little bit of that colour in some of the other areas also. Not everywhere, but just here and there. It creates a balance to the painting. So I'm just going to warm up some of the areas now on the goose where the light is being reflected up into the structure of the goose. And you see how it creates a roundedness to the animal and a roundedness to those forms. Using the same colours, I'm again putting them here and there into the painting, into the background. A little bit lighter now, because this is where I want the dappled light to be showing. This is where the light's coming from. So using big bold strokes there. They're very considered as well. When you applying the paint, you have to consider each brush stroke, where it's going to go and how bold and how large that brush stroke is going to be. You can do this haphazardly, but it's much better at this stage to control where you want the paint to go. Reaffirming those light areas again, because acrylic paint will tend to sink in a little as it dries. So going over with thickened paint will reaffirm those lighter areas. Very little water, if any, should be used when applying the paint. Try and use the paint directly as it comes from the tube. When you can mix it obviously on your palette, but if you use it directly without adding any thinner to it, you will get much more luscious brush strokes and much more vibrancy of colour. As you thin colours in acrylics, they will become more transparent and wishy-washy, so you need to get a thickness of the paint. Right, we're going to put a few more details here with a smaller brush now to create this more realistic area that I want the viewer's eye to rest upon most. So it's a cadmium orange with a little bit of yellow ochre and a little touch of white, and darken it down with a little hint of blue or green to put in the darker areas, adding a little bit more red as well to keep the warmth of that colour. Again, one or two little spots of the same colour into the background to create that harmony. I'm going to add a few more of the lighter areas to the beak. This is where the sunlight will be bouncing off the edge of the beak. And you'll notice that I'm not doing a line of light all the way along it. Can you see it's thicker in some areas than it is in others? That's because to create the illusion of light on a straight edge, it's best to paint a ragged line rather than one uniform line across it, because the light will seem to bounce along that edge and create a more realistic style. So you keep adding those little background colours, foreground colours to the background and background colours to the foreground, just to create the harmony. You can use the edge of the brush to roll the paint onto the painting, as I have done there. Okay, we're going to do a little bit more detail onto the eye area. This is where people tend to view animals by looking closely at the eye. That's where the viewer's eye tends to rest always on an animal, are the eyes. So this is where you want the most detail to be, the most realistic detail to be. This style, remember, is called deconstructed realism, which is a cross between realism, photorealism, impressionism, expressionism and abstract. So, remembering what I said about the light bouncing along those straight edges, it creates the illusion of light, much better than doing one complete highlight brushstroke. Still using the back of the brush every now and again. The paint is still wet at this point. By using this medium, the retarder, the paint can still be moved around, although it is starting to dry a little, and you can reactivate it by giving it a very light spray of water. So we're going to put a highlight under the eye where the light can be bouncing off the lower lid. Just a few little touches just to lighten up some of the areas. We're going to do the detail of the eye, a couple of little highlights of grey, a bluey grey, and then a pure white on the top. Just little dots of light. And it creates the eye. Thickening up the paint again, the impasto, in those areas I want to really shine and stand out. Remember, it's about the texture of the brushstroke at this stage. Those highlight areas should be nice and thick. Light areas thick, dark areas thin. That is the golden rule. It's how the old masters used to paint. A couple of little dots here and there of the light as it bounces around and picks out little areas of the background. Again, pulling out those highlights on the beak. And that's it, more or less finished. It's up to you when you think you've done enough. Don't do too much, remember. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you have any questions or comments, do please ask and I'll do my very best to help. In the meantime, I'll see you on the next video.